Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls.
Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming now.
You really want what happened to this woman? It happened to you?
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find. So am I.
Long Bright River. A limited series. Streaming now. Only on Peacock.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Es posible que te excites un poco cuando compres en Burlington.
¡Qué precio tan bajo!
¿Qué es eso?
¡Ah, tienen mi marca favorita!
¡Es como un Burlington completamente nuevo! ¡Puedo comprar 2! ¡Wow!
¡Estoy ahorrando mucho!
Burlington te ahorra hasta un 60% de descuento en los precios de otras tiendas todos los días. ¿Serán los precios bajos o las grandes marcas? Te encantarán las ofertas. Te encantará Burlington. ¡Burlington! Te lo dije. Los estilos y selecciones varían por tienda.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Margaret Cleeve, and I'm very pleased today to welcome Professor Patricia Owens to the podcast. Her book is absolutely fascinating, and I'm very excited to talk about it. It's titled Erased, A History of International Thought Without Men, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. This book does pretty much what it says. It analyzes the intellectual history, in some ways the political history of the academic field of international relations, helping us understand sort of how and why this field of IR has ended up in a particular way now that focuses a lot, for example, on theory, that focuses on a lot on particular key thinkers. It turns out it didn't have to be that way. There were a whole bunch of other ideas and thinkers in this field early on that we don't have anymore. Why not? What could international relations have looked like if it had gone very differently? All these questions and more are absolutely fascinatingly investigated in this book. So Patricia, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about it.
Thanks so much, Miranda. It's wonderful to be with you.
Could you start us off, please, by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
Sure. Well, I'm a professor of international relations at Oxford and a fellow of Somerville College. And I was the principal investigator on the Leverhulme research project on women in the history of international thought, which ran for 5 years and wrapped up in 2023. And that was a collaboration with Katerina Rietzler, an historian, and Kim Hutchings, an international political theorist. And we had a postdoc, Sarah Dunstan, and others who we decided we would do a recovery history because we knew that that what the historians were telling us about the presence of women and their significance in the early field was not reflected in accounts of the history of IR. So that's sort of where I come from when I started writing this book.
That's a helpful foundation, I suppose, to what we're going to be discussing is this kind of question of, wait a second, where are these women? What happened? So probably the simplest place to start is just, who are these women? Can you give us a brief overview of the cohort you examine, how you think of them as a group, and how you chose who to focus on?
Yeah. I mean, so I was really tired of reading histories of international thought without women. And that is the kind of main thrust and reason why I wanted to write this book. And so this cohort that I'm working with in this part of the project is really on the British side. But they're not all British women. So these figures there's about a dozen that I go into in some depth. They were all born in imperial metropoles or colonies, all thought very deeply about this subject of international relations, right, which we think, and certainly at the time, was understood quite broadly as the relations between peoples, empires, and states. And all but one of the figures was quite closely associated with this new scholarly field as it was emerging in the early decades of the 20th century in and around the British context. all were understood themselves, were defined as women. The category of women is an historical category, not a sort of biological or essentialist one in this project. And almost all, interestingly, I didn't understand this at the time when I was sort of reading them and thinking about how I was going to be working with them in this book. They were all ended up being quite deeply historical figures in different ways and in different modes and genres. And that becomes quite important for some of the lessons and conclusions that I draw about the development of the field.
That's helpful to understand, and really interesting as well to think about the ways in which this evolved as you investigated. And that really goes to the point you're making, obviously, with the book's title, Erased, that these women were so erased from the history of international relations that as soon as you started looking, it wasn't like, oh, here's this group and it's already super coherent. It's like, well, actually, no, there is a lot of investigating and thinking to do to understand what each of the women was doing and how the rest of other men in the sort of field reacted to it. So I think that's probably how we're going to proceed with this conversation, kind of looking at some of these women. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go into as much detail as the book does, but hopefully we'll give listeners a good overview of some of these key figures and how they related to international relations and how it reacted to them, et cetera, et cetera. So starting, I suppose, at the beginning, thinking about sort of international relations before it was a super established field and when it sounds like there could have been other directions it might have gone in. Can you tell us about the direction that Lucy Zimmern was taking international relations in and why, if the project that eventually progressed of kind of white male British international relations was to continue, her version couldn't be the direction they went down?
Yeah, that's right. So Lucy Zimmern begins in the story as Lucy Barbier. So before she meets Alfred Zimmern, so Lucy Zimmern is understood she's sort of in footnotes and mentioned here and there in existing intellectual and disciplinary histories as the wife of a kind of great male canonical thinker, Alfred Zimmern, who was the first Woodrow Wilson Professor of International Relations in Aberystwyth and the first Montagu Burton Professor of International Relations at Oxford. So he's a major figure in histories of international thought, and also one of the kind of key so-called idealists of the interwar years, who then become the foil for the emergence of realism in the 1950s. So that matters, as I'll explain. So Lucy Barbier was in Aberystwyth before Alfred arrived in 1919, and she was already developing what my co-author and I in a different article on Lucy called a kind of form of polyphonic internationalism. So she was a musical diplomat. She was an accomplished singer and a teacher. She brought French musicians to Britain, and this was all part of her attempt to bring a sort of forms of internationalism, cultural diplomacy in her own particular way, a sort of return to entente cordiale or a rapprochement between France and Britain at the time. She was very anxious about the kind of emerging German hegemony and the fate of French citizens within a resurgent Germany in Europe. And so there was a political angle to her work. But she thought about international relations through the lens of culture. And she actually, if anybody knows anything about the history of international relations in Aberystwyth, the siblings who helped to found the first chair in Aberystwyth gave a lot of money to found the first chair, but they were also already giving money to Lucy Zimmern for her cultural internationalism before Alfred Zimmern ever came. So she was already a key thinker around questions of international relations. And so when Alfred arrived, they met, they fell in love, and there was a scandal, and Alfred was forced to resign because she was already married to the professor of French, and so this was not tolerated. And so they left Aberystwyth and created together the Geneva School of International Studies, which was often known as the Zimmern School, because it was after both Alfred and Lucy. And Lucy really shaped the distinctiveness of the Zimmern School. I mean, the Zimmern School, the Geneva School, was really the most significant internationalist educational project of the interwar years. Major thinkers came and studied there and lectured there. This sort of cultural diplomacy, cultural internationalism, polyphonic internationalism was key to understanding the work of the Geneva School. And what's interesting about this is that Nicholas Speakman, who was the deputy director. Alfred was the director, Nicholas Speakman was the deputy director, and Lucy Barbier, now Lucy Zimmern, was only then the assistant to the director. But she was really running the school, and she shaped its intellectual content profoundly. And this set her in a course of conflict with Nicholas Speakman, who was an American, who's a Dutch-American political scientist, one of the earliest, most significant realist thinkers. And he was pushing our international relations towards more of a kind of realist policy science with sort of political science methods. And this conflicted with Lucy, who was much more about feelings and more about getting students to sort of really reflect on their complicity in all kinds of international hierarchies and to understand themselves as representatives of different nations. And she wanted to bring in, she brought in African-American musicians and scholars to talk about racial hierarchy in the US. She had students talking and thinking about gender. And it was very, very different to what Speakman wanted. But in many ways, the clash between Speakman and Lucy prefigures so much of the kind of debates within IR that have sort of shaped many versions of the history of the field through the 20th century. So Lucy becomes sidelined in the 1940s, 50s project of sort of revisioning what IR could be. And Alfred becomes the main interlocutor with Nicholas Speakman in the early surveys of the debates of the field. I mean, one of them established by a famous figure in the history of the field, Hans Morgenthau, and his student, Kenneth Thompson. But they said the main protagonists of the interwar debate between realists and idealists was Alfred and Nicholas Speakman, but raising Lucy, but actually it was Speakman's nemesis at Geneva was Lucy and not Alfred. So she's erased, but she's also unfortunately missing in the new research, the new historiography, which challenges the idea of there being a great debate between realists and idealists in the 1920s. And, you know, they haven't noticed that actually there was. The idea was that the myth, there was no real great debate in the interwar period between idealists and realists. Well, actually we find one in the Geneva School, and it's over how international relations should be taught. And it was between Nicholas Speakman, one of the founders of Realist IR, and Lucy Zimmern.
I found this absolutely fascinating. As you said, it is kind of erased in two separate ways, right? Whether or not the question is there is a debate, but it's over these people, not her, or, oh no, there wasn't a debate at all. And it's interesting to think about how this so early on was a debate around teaching in a lot of ways. But of course, that's not the only aspect of international relations where women were erased. I wonder if we can turn to talking about research. Chatham House, of course, is a key institution here. Why was there no Margaret Cleeve Prize for Research until suddenly there was, but not until 2022? What's happening here with research?
That's a really, really good question. And also what counts as research and intellectual labor is key to answering that question. So Margaret Cleeve, let me just say a little bit about who she was. So she was really a major figure in the history of Chatham House. She joined in 1921, and she was the head of the information department at Chatham House for 25 years. She retired in 1955. And at that event, you know, people were saying, you know, there's you know, almost nobody in the history of Chatham House who has been responsible for what it excelled at and what it became known for, which was, you know, producing the kind of contemporary history of international relations. So before the information age, and my colleague, again, Katerina Rietzlow on the WIT project, has done some really important work on think tanks and has helped to shape this account of the significance of different forms of intellectual labor in the history of international relations. You know, so one of the things that Chatham House, in the back room of Chatham House, what it was doing was gathering the data, the contemporary information, the contemporary archive from which new writings on international relations as contemporary history could be produced. So press clippings in multiple languages, anything that was written about international relations, government documents, the library, the journal International Affairs. This was the core material for the teaching and research of international relations as it was emerging in the 20s and 30s as a sort of new science of international relations. And Chatham House is essential to the establishment of this early idea of a science of international relations, which at that time meant sort of anonymous peer review, using the most contemporary and up-to-date source material. The this was, Chatham House. This was consolidated really in Britain in Chatham House, not in the universities. And so Margaret Cleeve and her team of largely women in the information department at Chatham House were fundamental to that. And this is intellectual labor. You're making selections, you're editing, you're translating. This is really important work. And this was recognized at her retirement in 1955. And then when she died in 1967, it was suggested. So Lewis Simpson, who had been a former head of the press library, suggested that the Chatham House name a research prize in her honor because Cleeve was, apart from Lionel Curtis, the sort of founder of Chatham House, really nobody had been more influential on the history and standing of Chatham House than Margaret Cleeve. So it sort of made perfect sense. And so this was put to Iverson McCallum, who was the director of Chatham House at the time, or deputy director. Andrew Schonfeld was then director of research. And there was a sort of discussion among some of the great men at Chatham House at the time about whether or not they should honor Margaret Cleeve at that time. And they basically, I think in quite gendered way, devalued Margaret Cleeve. So she goes from being completely indispensable and recognized for her devotion to the organization, and she was unmarried. Many of the women in the story I'm uncovering here, they were unmarried. They devoted their lives to their work. In this case, to Chatham House, to a major organization. Some of the women in the story devoted their lives to supporting a great man, but Cleeve devoted her life to Chatham House, and suddenly now, when it involves recognizing her and honoring this kind of intellectual labor, suggested by somebody, also another backroom person working at Chatham House, and that would, of course, meant a lot to someone like Lewis Simpson and all the other workers in the back rooms of Chatham House. They declined, and there were sort of three reasons really why it was suggested that nobody really around today would really know who Chatham House was, so there was no point in really honoring her in that way, because it was only sort of the sort of older people working in the information department that would really know who she was. There was sort of her contribution to Chatham House was at that point diminished. So rather than being absolutely essential to the success of Chatham House, questions were raised about, her contribution was solid, but perhaps not as distinguished. And, she had presided over a period of Chatham House's, decline, as if that was the fact that there were no major intellectual studies produced in the 1950s and 60s during the period of British decline and decolonization was somehow a function of Margaret Cleeve rather than the intellectual standing of international relations in Chatham House itself. And the last one, which is the one that bothers me the most when I was reading it, knowing what Cleeve had done, was that they thought it was just too much effort. It was a little bit too much effort. It was a bit laborious, and they didn't really want to expend their energies on honoring Margaret Cleeve in this way. So by 2022, of course, when organizations get a lot of credit for recognizing, their dead lives histories and, lost women and people of color getting recognized at this historical moment, that Chatham House might gain from its association with a figure such as Margaret Cleeve. And that's a slightly cynical interpretation of the Margaret Cleeve lecture, which is how she was honored. It's not a Cleeve Prize for Research, but it was originally a Cleeve Prize for Research that was suggested by Lewis Simpson all those years ago.
Dear old work platform, it's not you, it's us. Actually, it is you. Endless onboarding? Constant IT bottlenecks? We've had enough. We need a platform that just gets us. And to be honest, we've met someone new. They're called Monday.com, and it was love at first onboarding. Their beautiful dashboards, their customizable workflows got us floating on a digital cloud 9. So no hard feelings, but we're moving on. Monday.com, the first work platform you'll love to use.
Hi, this is Javon, your Blinds.com design consultant.
Oh, wow. A real person.
Yep. I'm here to help with everything from selecting the perfect window treatments to...
Well, I've got a complicated project.
No problem. I can even help schedule a professional measure and install. We can also send you samples fast and free.
I just might have to do more.
Whatever you need.
So the first room we're looking at is for...
Shop Blinds.com now and save up to 45% site-wide. Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Yeah, the too much effort side of things really calls into question these ideas about labor and whose labor and what kind of labor. And I think anyone who's ever edited anything, much less an entire journal, would realize that that's rather a lot of work that certainly deserves recognition. And a research prize does not seem like too much work to me, but at least now we know more about that story, whether or not we take the lecture as it exists now cynically or not. Having that history excavated is certainly quite helpful and really showcases, I think, how much kind of combining these two pieces you've told us so far about Lucy Zimmern and Margaret Cleeve, right? It is these erasures are happening on the education side. They're happening on the research side. They're happening in a lot of different ways. And so I wonder if we can continue that by talking about another woman you discuss in the book, Agnes Headlam-Morley, and the ways in which her work, her contributions, her labor were seen as a threat to this idea of international relations, specifically the idea of making international relations its own discipline. Oh, it's not a history, it's not political science. No, it's international relations. We're separate from all the other ones. Why was Agnes's work seen as being critical of this project? To what extent, maybe, might we realistically examine or more agree with her critique than they did? What was going on here with this idea of a separate IR and Agnes's role within that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Agnes Headlam-Morley is interesting. She's sort of British IR sort of second most vilified woman after Lucy Zimmern. She was the Montague Burton Chair of International Relations at Oxford from 1948 to 1971, right? So she was really she held the most prominent chair in international relations for, 3 decades and almost 3 decades. And these were core years in the project for a separate IR, right? So before then, international relations was an interdiscipline. It was it was more like a multidiscipline, and that nobody had PhDs or degrees in international relations. They came to the subject as historians, as classicists, as anthropologists, as lawyers, as increasingly sociologists, and they taught this subject from these different lenses. And this was quite distinct. This was particular to Britain. In the United States, it was always a bit much more political science. International relations was kind of like political science. This was adopted in the European context, and we sort of have a sense of this today. But in Britain, the historians were much more influential, and they were the ones who were mostly teaching international relations as diplomatic history. And Agnes Headlam-Morley was one of these. She was a diplomatic historian. She was the daughter of a very influential diplomatic historian, James Headlam-Morley. She was often denigrated and criticized as if her interest in international relations was sort of inherited from her father. She didn't help with this by constantly praising him and editing his work and not allowing anything possibly negative to be said about him in the Times. So she was the scourge of a sort of the project for a separate IR. And that project was led by lawyers and sociologists in London, Charles Manning, George Schwarzenberger in the 1950s, who wanted to create this sort of distinctive position for IR in the universities as a teaching subject and as a research field that was its own project, that was not defined by method but by subjects, and specifically by a certain kind of sociological theorization of the international. The idea that IR could only be its own subject if it had an underpinning theory, and that was the theory of international society from Manning's perspective and Schwarzenberger's. Manning was at the LSE, and he was the Montague Burton Professor of IR LSE for over 3 decades, and George Schwarzenberger was at the senior professor at University College London. And they were both trained lawyers who discovered sociology and sociological theory and that this was going to be the sort of way in which IR would establish itself as a separate subject. But the main skeptics of this project were the historians, and they were not. They was queried whether, without rigorous training in one or other methodological approach, whether that be history, law, anthropology, whether this kind of project would produce anything more than dilettantes. And some of the earliest figures we associate with the field of IR, like E.H. Carr in the British context, E.H. Carr, Martin White, they themselves abandoned IR precisely because of this attempt to push it into this other direction of being not something that people with rigorous training would come to and seek to understand international relations from the perspective of their fields, in conversation with people in other fields, of course, was going to work. And they basically called it an abject failure. And the sort of discourse of IR as a failure as an intellectual project does actually go back to the 50s and 60s in this period. And so Agnes Headlam-Morley was one of these who was sort of like, well, what's the point of this? What are we actually gaining from Charles Manning's musings about international society? And she was highly skeptical of this, and she was a sort of proud diplomatic historian, and the centrality and the importance of understanding the primary sources. And she, for her, what was most important was sort of what does it mean to talk about Britain and France, and what are the the diplomatic negotiations and wranglings between them at any particular point. Now, this is not to celebrate her approach to diplomatic history; it's very problematic and narrow. But she was, I think, onto something when she was highly skeptical. But she was roundly criticised for not developing the subject, partly because it was bums on seats. I mean, international relations was a really popular subject then, as now, and she didn't sort of push for a separate graduate program, for example, at Oxford, and later IR appointments like Hedley Bull and others quickly established one when she retired. So she was really the caricature, or really, I think, the gendered foil for the project of a separate IR, right? That the London men were pursuing, and this built on this kind of caricature that that historians describe what happens, but we need theorists to really account for why this has happened. And it was built on a distinction between kind of Oxford and London, between Agnes Headlam-Morley and Charles Manning. And she was, roundly criticised and caricatured. But today, I think, when we look at the sort of most interesting work in international relations, in many ways, it is not the heirs of Charles Manning. It's the heirs to its international global historians, potentially the heirs to Agnes Headlam-Morley. I'll mention an example here. She, Merze Tate, was drawn into, returning back to the question of Lucy Zimmern and the Geneva School, Merze Tate was drawn into international relations by the way that Lucy Zimmern was teaching it in Geneva. Literally. This is in a story that Barbara Savage has revealed in her biography of Merze Tate, who is a figure in the book as well. She went to Oxford and study international relations with Alfred Zimmern, but ended up actually being supervised to completion by Agnes Headlam-Morley. And she was she was a sort of hard teacher of archival methods to Merze Tate, who went on to become a really significant diplomatic international historian and theorist of empire, and somebody who was a key figure in Robert Vitalis's White World Order, Black Power politics. And Merze Tate's importance in 20th century international thinking, I think, can't be has been really underappreciated, and I think we now have a better understanding of this. And it's through it's Lucy Zimmern and Agnes Headlam-Morley who were key figures in Tate's development as somebody interested in this new subject of international relations, and in establishing a kind of certain approach to international relations. And so, when I think about Merze Tate in that as a sort of heir again to those projects, I think that there's more to Agnes Headlam-Morley's critique of the international relations as a separate project than many of her contemporary critics have suggested.
Yeah, this is really interesting to understand the ways in which things we're still debating today have much earlier origins than perhaps we usually think, around the bums and seats, around the role of theory. These are not new debates, as your work helps us understand. But I wonder if we can talk next about something that's we've both mentioned a few times so far, but we haven't really delved into yet, and I'd like to, which is, of course, empire. That's certainly happening during this whole period. That's certainly something that international relations, in whichever strand of it we want to talk about, is talking about. Of course, other disciplines are as well. But one figure in particular you talk about in the book around discussions of empire and how that fits into these debates about what is international relations is Margery Perham, I suppose I'm guessing how her name is pronounced. And of course, Margery was a woman, which, as we're learning, is a problem for some of these people with their particular project of white male British international relations. How are these things linked? How is her gender linked with her work on empire? And is her work on empire why she was erased? Was her gender why she was erased? Was the linking of those two things why she was marginalised in the intellectual history of international relations?
This is really interesting. And Perham is fascinating to me in that she's quite different to some of the other women. So she, without question, let me just say who she was. She was Britain's authoritative voice on empire across the 4 decades of the middle 20th century, right? So when empire reached its greatest extent to when it collapsed. Nobody had more influence on thinking about, understanding, educating people on, and practicing colonial administration in Africa in particular than Perham. And so she's sui generis in how she traversed academia. She was an historian, policy. She was very close to the Arthur Creech Jones, the Labour colonial secretary. Media and broadcasting. She was constantly writing letters, missives to the Times. She did over 100 broadcasts. She was really the voice that most ordinary people British people would have heard speaking about the empire across that period. And I think that gender is inextricable to that, to how she became so influential. Ironically, right? Perhaps we might think in many other ways that she was a woman might make it less likely that she would become so influential. But I think the way she deployed her sex was interesting. She never ever challenged the gender order of the empire. She celebrated in some ways colonial paternalism while continually trying to reform it. So she was a major voice of reform. She always positioned herself sort of between the sort of worst excesses of white settlers in the colonies, particularly in Africa, in Kenya, and in South Africa specifically, and what she would call the sort of the radical black nationalist critiques of the empire. So she's positioned often as sort of Britain's conscience on empire. So she's a reformer. She was, pushing a sort of, towards a more welfarist understanding of empire. Again, we can have a sort of gendered reading of that. And she cajoled. She had the respect of generations of colonial men in the colonial service. She was a teacher of colonial service cadets for generations. She got on very well with them, and with men in senior positions as well. She was taken very seriously by, the powers that be. And she used that, her gender, perhaps her sexuality to some extent to influence them, but in a way that didn't fundamentally challenge their understandings of gender hierarchy and gender distinctions. And in some ways, actually, she was also a beneficiary of some of these. She had teams of women research assistants, and she ended up living with her sister, who took care of all domestic affairs and domestic matters. So she was in some ways, the beneficiary of a kind of gender order that is set up to support the labours, intellectual labours of men, but she has got herself into that position. she did not reflect too much on that, be fair. And she was also, she was read through a highly gendered lens as well, right? So she, as she got older, she was interpreted as a kind of more sort of meddlesome woman. But she also, she was also did maintain this kind of, role, a very eminent role. But she never married, and some contemporary interpreters have suggested that her fascination and her obsession, her workaholism, was a kind of sexual displacement activity. Her obsession with Africa was what she did instead of tend to the house and raise the children, which of course is deeply problematic reading of women's intellectual labor, which is I discuss in the book. It's her subjects it's the marginalization from IR in the 60s of her subjects of empire and decolonization that mean that Perham as an interlocutor is erased as well, right? So what's sort of partly tragic about this is that more than any of the sort of major of the male thinkers that we associate with sort of mid-20th century IR, say that those associated with the English school, much more than any of those, Perham engaged directly with leading Black intellectuals, critics of empire, theorists of decolonization. Now, she'd engaged with them in quite problematic ways. She engaged with them often to assimilate their critique in order to maintain empire rather than to undermine it. But she saw herself as a white ally, and she, her mode of engagement is not the sort of model for engaging, but it is that she did meant that when she was pushed, when she became sort of unthinkable as somebody that we might be reading in international relations to think about empire, decolonization, and its legacies, she's just not there. We don't have her as someone who we might critically engage with. So that's a loss. That's a loss for IR. So I think it's primarily her intellectual interests that mean that she's just not somebody that would be considered to be part of the intellectual history of international relations. She's briefly mentioned, but she's nowhere near as much studied, surprisingly, as other less significant thinkers. Really, when I think about 20th century international relations, it was women who were really the leading thinkers of their generation, and Perham was one of these. I can give some other examples later on. We can talk a little bit about Susan Strange and Claudia Jones. And Margaret Cleeve. Nobody was more influential than these figures, and yet they are, not central to our understanding of the history of international thinking in the 20th century, which is quite bizarre.
Is this also why empire as a topic is also less part of our understanding of kind of what is core to international relations? Obviously, if Margery was such a big deal in the discussions about empire and she's been marginalized from the history, that would help explain how, when, and why empire stopped being seen as such a core part? Or am I making a false connection there?
The land has been thrown into disorder.
As Trump rips up the rule books, Musk breaks apart the government, and Vance offends allies, it's official. We're living through the era of the global enduring disorder. My name is Jason Pack. I'm a podcast fellow for the New Books Network and host of the Disorder podcast. I've seen a fair amount of disorder in my day. I lived in Libya in the late Gaddafi period. I worked in Syria and in Iraq. I've been kidnapped twice. But this is the worst I've seen. The rules-based international order that has reigned for 80 years no longer applies. So I want to bring a nerdy New Books Network kind of approach to understanding how did we get here, and what can we do to restore a semblance of order to our mad, 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 mad world.
We will fight those powerful and nefarious forces of neoliberalism and oligarchy. We will overthrow them and restore harmony to the land.
We need you, the mega orderer, to listen and help us order the disorder. So search Disorder in your podcast app to listen right now.
No, I think the primary historical erasure. There are multiple erasures really in the book. So the three, and they are related to what by the 1990s becomes the discourse of IR's failure as an intellectual project, but at that point it was not identified as such. The erasure of empire, historical method, and women and people of color from international relations. These are overlapping, linked erasures from the project of a separate IR that begins in the 1950s. But empire was, again, there's more of a variegated picture. So empire was taught as international relations in Oxford for longer than, for example, at the LSE at UCL. There was an expert on colonial administration in Aberystwyth for some time, I think up through to the 1960s, another diplomatic historian. But the sort of, again, this idea that the way in which we can have a separate IR is by theorizing the relationships between the society of states, aka the society of white states, in the 50s, during the period of, from the beginning of period of decolonization, when, the newly independent states are making claims on at the UN, but Manning is saying that what we really need to be theorizing and understanding is this sort of norms of relations between states that are merged in the earlier periods of the European Society of States, tells us something about the discomfort with both empire and what that means. Of course, Manning was a South African South African lifelong supporter of apartheid. Is not really a coincidence. It's not that imperialism doesn't completely disappear, but it becomes one among many forms of ways in which states pursue power in international relations, rather than a kind of core ordering principle of international relations, and it's more theorized rather than historicized. Members of the English school, they were very interested in empire, but they were interested in empire's past, not very much interested in empire's present. So that the pushing out of historians is part of the erasure of empire as well. This also then means that, women historians, but also anthropologists and colonial, who anthropology was one of the ways in which colonial administration was taught and theorized. And so Lucy Philip Mayer, who is another important figure in the story, who taught colonial administration as international relations at the LSE when it established its separate international then studies department in 1927. She was one of the earliest people appointed, 3 years before Charles Manning. When after Manning was appointed in 1930, no woman was hired under his reign for another 32 years. So Lucy Philip Mayer was teaching colonial administration as a trained anthropologist at LSE as international relations. And so the erasure of empire is part of that. Also is related to partly the reorganization of academic disciplines in the context of the major transformations of world politics in the 50s and 60s too. And so she migrates from international relations to anthropology at LSE. But other figures but she's written out the early history of the department by Charles Manning in different ways. But other historians of empire, such as Sybil Crow, Agatha Ram, others, then, they become less, they're less likely to be recognized as international relations scholars when we think about then histories of IR.
Yeah, I mean, anthropology is definitely not what we tend to think of immediately when we think of IR today, but it, of course, as soon as we're talking about it in the context of empire and adding on to what you were saying earlier about kind of, well, what is the training people come into with and how much does theory have to be part of this? It's all these pieces are linked, which makes a lot of sense given that you are talking about these women as a cohort. And as you said, it's all interlinked erasures and connections. And I think, therefore, it's worth at this point mentioning Claudia Jones, who you briefly talked about earlier. You at least mentioned her earlier. Can we talk more about her at this point, given her work and the multiple erasures we've already outlined? You describe her in the book as offering, quote, the greatest challenge to international relations' existing intellectual histories. Now that we've got a sense of kind of the many problems of those existing intellectual histories, can you tell us more about Claudia Jones?
Yeah, she's amazing. She's brilliant. She's not unknown outside of IR. In fact, there's a major biography on her by Carol Boyce Davies, and there are various rumors about biopics that sort of surface and disappear. So I hope that she'll get a kind of wider recognition, though of course she's also widely known as the founder of the Notting Hill Carnival. So again, Claudia Jones is not unknown, much the way that Margery Perham isn't unknown, but their sort of place as international thinkers as thinkers that might be part of the story of the inclusions and exclusions within a particular field. She's fascinating and again missing in histories of British international thinking. So I ask about Claudia Jones, like, what is British international thought, right? Is Claudia Jones, who was born in Trinidad, emigrated to Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1910s, 1920s, makes her way through. She leaves school before she doesn't graduate beyond high school or receive education beyond high school, and is an organic intellectual in the kind of Black Marxist tradition. So she was. Her kind of institutional, without a sort of security of an academic position, of course, her sort of institutional security is through the Black press and through the Communist Party of the United States. And for her leadership in that context, I mean, she was one of the early theorists of, well, she was a really profound thinker of the triple oppression of Black women. The Communist Party of the United States was really the only communist party where one of the few, I should say, where the Black intellectuals were absolutely central to the party and its thinking, and Jones was central to that. She was, for her work around organizing labor, organizing women towards anti-imperial movements. She was, in the context of McCarthyism, she was expelled from the United States. She was deported to Britain because she had a British passport, because Trinidad, where she was born, was a British colony, and so she was entitled to move to Britain, and there she became one of the leading thinkers of the late 1950s, early 1960s, before she suddenly died of a heart attack. Educating Black and brown thinkers about how to think about international relations. She established the West Indian Gazette after she was marginalised from the British Communist Party. She was given menial work rather than a sort of the leading role that she had in the Communist Party of the USA. They didn't really know what to do with this sort of charismatic Black woman, and so she established her own newspaper. She was very, very active in anti-colonial, anti-racist movements in London in the late 50s and early 1960s before she died. But the West Indian Gazette was really a significant newspaper that she founded and edited and wrote for. And it really did shape how, again, tens of thousands of British people thought about international relations and new post-colonial orders. And so she's, why she's the greatest challenge to international relations in existing intellectual histories is because of the audiences that she was trying to reach, because of the genres within which she wrote. So she was a journalist, and because of her multiple identities. And so, she's clearly part of the story of British thinking about international relations in Britain at that time. I'm not going to sort of label her as as British, but she claimed her British passport because that was the way in which she could make the most, that was where she wanted to go after she was deported from the United States. And so she's a really major thinker on international relations, on anti-colonialism, on efforts to found new kind of federations in the decolonizing moment. She was a great advocate for West Indian Federation. She was a massive critic of U.S. and British foreign policy. Her office is at the West Indian Gazette, served as a kind of consular for West Indian migrants to Britain, the sort of Windrush generation, when they were experiencing housing and labor and all kinds of other forms of discrimination. She was an advocate for them. She was considered, so important. Martin Luther King visited her in her home on his way to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. When she went to a tour of China, she was received by Chairman Mao. I mean, she's a world historical figure, and is absent in our intellectual histories. Partly also because of the sort of strange separation between Black women's international intellectual history and international relations intellectual history. And so this is obviously a racialized distinction. That means that we have already great studies of figures like Claudia Jones, but they're not seen as part of the wider field of the history of international thought by IR scholars, with a few exceptions. So that's why I think of her as the greatest challenge.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense when you put all of those pieces together. I wonder if we can now move to talking about one of the women that, or maybe the only woman in the book that is actually pretty well known in existing intellectual histories of international relations. We've mentioned Susan Strange a few times, but maybe at first glance it seems odd to include her in this book titled Erased, because she hasn't been erased in the ways that some of the others we've discussed have been, until we start to look closely, right? And then there are some ways in which she does fit into this cohort. So can you tell us about why it's important for you to have included her in this group?
Yeah, I mean, so she's definitely the figure who is received recognition, right? So most people in IR will know who at least the name Susan Strange. She's very well known in international political economy. She's mentioned in surveys of international relations thinkers. But I mean, I wouldn't say that she's understood that there have been kind of many intellectual historical treatments of Susan Strange. And so I'm interested in thinking of her in the I'm interested in how, in a story about erasure, an important part of that story has to be, okay, well, so who then gets constituted as the exceptional woman? How does the way that Susan Strange's presentation as the kind of the exception help to continue to erase the other figures, the other women, all the many that I've been talking about? So if Susan Strange is included, then it can be said that, well, the main woman was included and we have done our job. And so there's questions about how Susan Strange is recognized, why. And to me, I think that it's as much about, or I'm as interested in Susan Strange's persona and her invention of a kind of persona and the way she approached international relations that is as interesting to me and part of the story about how she became this sort of exceptional woman than her work, than her scholarship. I mean, she is a significant figure. She was one of the founding members of BISA. She founded the International Political Economy Group. She was hugely significant in Chatham House, but she wasn't actually an exceptional woman because there were very many others. What was most exceptional about Susan Strange was that she was a mother of 6 children who insisted on returning to work full time, and that's really the exceptional thing about Susan Strange. She started a professional career as a journalist, and then she she thought that she'd be able to combine having children with an academic career more easily than as a journalist, although she did keep working for the Observer on the side of her first academic job, which was at the University of College London. So she was working with George Schwarzenberger, who I mentioned earlier at UCL. And they recognized that she was a smart cookie and she was really good. But what really bothered Schwarzenberger and George Keaton, who was the other chair of the department, was that the administrative inconvenience of her having these babies. Another theme of what really bothers some of these men is that when they have to deal with these women, and it's just a little bit, they see it as a little bit extra, it's just too much work. They would have to find maternity leave cover for her, and this was just too much. And so they literally bullied her out of her first academic job for having too many children. And she got herself a full-time research position at Chatham House, and then went on to become the Montagu Burton Professor of IR at LSE, and have this very, very significant influence on British IR. In many ways, she was the one pushing IR out of the kind of doldrums of the 1950s and 1960s into the kind of beginning of some more exciting field in the 80s and 90s. And Susan Strange was key to that, and her founding of BISA. One of the other things I really liked about bringing Susan Strange into the story was that I could, she absolutely derided and was dismissive of the kind of the field of what she saw as the sort of mediocre men who had populated IR up to her arrival. So she famously, just thought that Manning was terrible, that his conferences that he organized were, she called them like constipated. She had no time for, Martin White's project to create this sort of canon of international thinkers that we're all supposed to, go back and return to and read, and that this was the basis of international relations. And, she just thought that it was the IR to date, the one that had, emerged to push out the women, although that was not her critique, was stale and boring and intellectually, going nowhere. And what Britain and what British IR needed was a sort of energetic new field that centered around international political economy, that sort of got to, move past. And again, she helps in some sense. She's the heir to, oddly, Margery Perham in a way, that the vision of international relations that Susan Strange had was like beyond decolonization, beyond Commonwealth, beyond, she was interested in a kind of more dynamic, international political economy focused international relations. But in some sense, she was also the parallel to Margery Perham. If Perham's role was to sort of get British people used to the idea and accepting of the idea of imperial decline, and that Britain should not feel so bad about the empire and what it had done, Susan Strange is the sort of international political economy equivalent of British economic decline. She was not, she was rather, thinking about the decline of sterling and the significance of the American new international economic order, and thinking about Britain's role in that. And she was a pro-Europeanist, and Britain should move away from thinking about empire towards Europe. So Strange is interesting in lots of different ways, but I think that one of the other aspects in which to think about Strange in the context of this book is to think about how the way she became the kind of exceptional figure was a sort of alibi for it, and her sort of bluff, no nonsense empiricism, and famous dismissal of feminist IR at the International Studies Association conference in 1995 was a way that it slowed down and helped reinforce a kind of something of a conservative gender order and racial order in IR into the 1980s and 1990s. And I tell that story partly through this reading of a kind of iconic image of Susan Strange, where I sort of conceive of her as sort of the kind of like queen bee, an honorary exceptional woman, queen bee, and an honorary gentleman. Like Margery Perham, she didn't disrupt the gender order of 1970s, 1980s, or 90s British IR. One way she did that was by performing a certain kind of gender, but also marginalizing feminist work within IR. It's not that she had no sympathy for it, but that she was the queen bee, and feminists should just sort of get on with it and stop complaining and stop pointing out all the things that are problematic and wrong, and just sort of get on with it the way that she did, because after all, she had 6 children and transformed an intellectual field.
Imagínate que la esposa de mi jefe fue a Marzo en Marcha de Toyota y se compró un Prius espectacular.
Ajá.
Sí, me dijo que llegó al dealer y que le mostraron varios modelos.
Wow.
Y además hizo un test drive con la Highlander, la Sienna y la RAV4. ¿A dónde vas?
¡A Marzo en Marcha!
Ven a Marzo en Marcha de Toyota y obtén el modelo ideal para ti. El evento termina el 31 de marzo. Toyota, vayamos juntos. El inventario puede variar. Visita tu concesionario Toyota participante para más detalles.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with a Business Unlimited smartphone plan. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second internet plan with savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
So in some ways, erasure in a different sense, which is interesting to layer on to the other erasures we've been discussing so far, and very much makes the case for this being such a multifaceted history, and obviously multifaceted book as well. What then would you like to see with international relations going forward with all this history excavated?
I'd like to see, or to maintain, obviously the vibrant intellectual pluralism that is IR, right? So, I don't think with the field as we've worked out yet how to better teach IR in a sort of post-paradigm era and beyond the isms. So, the field has moved beyond the debating the kind of great big paradigmatic theories. We all know this now. We've all recognized widely that women are kind of post-paradigm era, but I'm not sure we've worked out quite how to teach this subject, especially to undergraduates beyond that. And I've been trying to think about that in some of my own teaching. I think we need to resist further British IR's further absorption into political science. There's a sort of merging of some comparative politics fields and questions with IR, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think that it does mean that the kind of more broader, pluralist, critical, constructivist IR needs to continue what it's been doing for some time now, which is strengthening its methods and strengthening its methods training, particularly though in other fields, including historical methods. Obviously, this sort of new return to kind of historical IR is to be welcomed. I would like to see more historical IR work, not just in conversation with and borrowing from the work of global and historians, international historians, and historians more broadly, but to do work that is a cutting edge and not sort of responding to the historiographical developments outside of itself, but to do work that is taken seriously by the community of historians outside of IR as well as inside IR. I think that's the big challenge. Returning to, in some sense, where IR came from in the British context, which is a multidiscipline, not necessarily interdiscipline, cross-discipline, or meta-discipline. It's a community of scholars interested in the international relations, broadly understood, coming with deep training and expertise in methods and approaches of the constituent disciplines and fields of international relations, and being able to speak authoritatively across both of those and have that work be taken seriously beyond in IR and also beyond IR. And I think that's the exciting challenge for the next generation, I think.
Definitely some interesting things there to keep an eye on. And you mentioned, of course, that some of them you're working into your own teaching. Is there anything else that you're currently working on or looking to work on next in teaching and publishing? Anything that you want to give us a brief sneak preview of?
Well, there's a few. One is I'm interested in exploring a few additional things about Margery Perham who we mentioned earlier, and specifically the contingencies and accidents that mean that she doesn't have the full-length biography that she so clearly deserves. So many of the other major figures that I write about in the book, some of them have full-length biographies, and that they do some biographies are doing something very specific. I'm obviously been influenced by them doing something different in this book, but Perham doesn't have that sort of equivalent. There is a short biographical treatment that came out in 2012 by Brad C. Fort, which is useful but very, very short, and I would not say is the sort of equivalent definitive biography, intellectual biography. And I'm interested in the sort of attempts to write that in the past. So when she retired, or when she died in 1982, the Leverhulme Trust and other organizations paid Patricia Pugh, who was an archivist and historian, for 4 to 5 years to organize her papers. And these were the largest papers ever bequeathed to the then Rhodes House Library in Oxford. And at the end of this, there were 771 boxes. The catalogue alone to the papers is 500 pages. I mean, the vast materials. And sometimes women thinkers it's difficult to kind of recover their work because there's, they're absent in archives. Their work is not deemed significant enough to keep and save. that's certainly not true with Margery Perham. I mean, there's an abundance of sources. And there was a committee established to try and find the biographer. And, one figure was selected, and then they withdrew for various reasons to do with their family moving overseas. Patricia Pugh herself, who had created this massive archive, she didn't finish the project for, again, other quite interesting reasons. And then so again, we have this short biography, and it would be a massive undertaking, but I'm just exploring the feasibility of doing this. But I'm also interested in the meta questions about, who gets major biographies and who doesn't, and the contingencies and accidents that mean that a figure of world historical importance like Margery Perham does not have that biography that she certainly would have had she born a man.
Well, that sounds very intriguing, especially, as you said, given the archival material. That's, historians' ears perk up there. So that sounds like a very fun project to go through and see what one could find from that. So best of luck with that investigation. And of course, while you are doing that, while you're going through all the boxes, making sense of it, of course, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled Erased, A History of International Thought Without Men, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. Patricia, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been fab.